Ever since the war started, the media often showered Ukraine's missile defenses with praise, intercepting 70 or 80% of Russian missiles in various attacks. That was back in early 2023. Then a pause in US military aid came, and by the end of 2023, media headlines reverted to reporting 30% of Russian missiles intercepted. As military aid restarted since this April, the situation seemed to have gotten better, at least according to contextless, sporadic media headlines. Percentages went to 60 and even 80%. But here's the thing. Successfully intercepting one missile attack on one day doesn't mean all the attacks in all regions on all days will be as successful, and those other attacks may not be reported. Plus, some reports seem to conflate intercepting Shahed attack drones with much faster and harder to intercept missiles. Ukraine's command was often producing data for such reports, picking out days when its interceptions were high and not mentioning days when interception percentages were low. Then came a wake-up call. Several weeks ago, Ukraine's own commander-in-chief, Oleksandr Syrskyi, presented the total numbers of Russian missiles and drones intercepted, coupled with the number of missiles Russia attacked with, and the figures, when taken in this proper context, are much less rosy. This video will go over the data and explain it all. A small digression. We have new nation-themed mug designs, this time without my pretty face. Check the link in the description if you're interested. Well, let's continue with our video. Data reveal came through Syrskyi himself as part of a meeting between local and regional authorities in Ukraine, and a data table was presented in the meeting and explained by Syrskyi. Data shows all the Russian missile attacks and Ukrainian interception performance since the very start of the war in February 2022 up to early August 2024. During said 2.5 years of war, Ukraine detected over 9,600 Russian missiles used over its land. Ukraine says it intercepted 2,400 of those missiles. That's 25%. Not a bad number for sure, but certainly not the averages touted by the media headlines. Of course, it's plausible, even probable, that actual numbers are somewhat different. Throughout history, some users tended to overstate their efficiency, and only later on it would become obvious interception rates weren't as good as they thought. There's also a possibility that some of the Russian missiles were not even tracked by Ukraine, and their impacts were labeled as due to something else and not a missile. But in the end, it's not that important whether the actual interception percentage is 20 or 25%. What's more interesting is further details found in Ukraine's own data, interception rates per individual missile type, which show which sort of missile attacks make sense and which do not. Drone attack statistics were listed separately. Ukraine claims Russia used 14,000 attack drones, of which little under 9,300 were intercepted. That's an interception rate of 66%, a much better figure, and one which can partly explain why the headlines were so optimistic, as news outlets possibly often conflated missile and drone strikes. Mass majority of attack drones were Shahed types. In essence, those are all cruise missiles. They fly for hundreds of kilometers, they have GPS guidance, and they ram into a target. It's just that they have a cheap piston engine. They're slow, they fly low, and they are generally easier to spot, track, and intercept, hence the fairly good interception rate. But they can't all be intercepted by guns, or even shoulder-launched SAMs. Part of the reason why Russia has used 14,000 such attack drones is to exhaust Ukrainian air defenses, not only to force them to use more potent systems with Sidewinder missiles, Azra missiles, AMRAAMs, and so on, but also to occasionally spot such SAMs being used. When Ukraine uses such systems for defense, it also means Russia has an opportunity to track down the location of such SAMs. Even if it can't engage them with more potent weapons, it can try to mark down their location and create a map of overall defenses, looking for routes with fewer defenses present for future cruise missile attacks. That, of course, is easier said than done, as Russia doesn't have enough intelligence-gathering assets present far away from the front lines. But let's get back to Russian missiles, which are more interesting than drones. The report said Russia used 111 Kinzhal missiles, of which 25% were intercepted. That's a very good interception rate, especially knowing that Kinzhal is a Mach 7 missile. It's fired from an aircraft at high altitude, giving it a longer reach than the Iskander M, which it was derived from. Cited interception rate is surprisingly high, which may or may not be true, but even said high rate can be explained. Kinzhal is essentially still a ballistic missile. Sure, it can maneuver to some degree, perhaps even more so than the US ATACMS, but in general it flies straight and then does some corkscrew maneuvers or goes up and down as it nears the target area, hoping that will confuse the defenses. As missiles cruise in the air, they usually reach 20 or 30 kilometers high up. They're tracked by both aerial radars of NATO countries and by ground-based radars across Ukraine. Tracking something that flies so high up isn't so hard. The hard part is the time available for interception, as the missile can traverse half of Ukraine in just 4 or so minutes. Interceptions won't happen high up. They happen lower and closer to interceptor launchers. Here we are talking almost exclusively about the Patriot PAC-3 system, which has that kind of capability. Still, said system has to be very near the target area to be able to protect it. Even if it's like 50 kilometers away, that's too far. Even if the missile is overflying the Patriot system, it likely won't be able to do much. It's a system for terminal area protection, which means it's perfectly suited for protecting itself. That's a situation where the attacker's missile is going straight for it, and the Patriot's mission is thus made so much easier. And that's exactly what was often going on. Russia tried to use Kinzhals to take out Patriot systems directly. That likely explains why so many Kinzhals were intercepted. We can take Iskander M as an example here. As we said, Kinzhal is derived from it. Iskander M is launched from the ground and has a shorter range, but it's otherwise similar. Ukraine's statistics also conflate North Korean KN-23 with it, but that's understandable. Two systems are also similar, and it's plausible Koreans base theirs on Iskander M technology shared with them by Russia. Anyway, a total of 1,300 Iskander Ms were fired, and only 4.5% were intercepted, even though Kinzhal is supposedly even a bit more capable than the Iskander M. But again, that can be explained by the fact Iskander M missiles were used on a wide array of targets, majority of which were not protected by PAC-3 Patriots. Ukraine basically had just 2 Patriot systems for much of 2023. Even today, it has only 4 Patriot batteries available. With a 30 or so kilometer reach against ballistic missiles, those can cover only a select few small areas in Ukraine. Moving on, 2 types of missiles that suffered quite high interception rates are your usual large subsonic cruise missiles. The Ha-101 and Ha-555 are listed together, even though the latter is an older missile with less pronounced stealth features, and has likely been available in higher numbers and used more. A huge 78% of both types conflated together have been intercepted. That shows it's not an effective weapon, but that's also a claim that could be used for most cruise missiles today, especially non-stealthy ones. Said missiles are pretty big and heavy. They're carried by bombers and they're essentially used against larger, more strategic kind of targets. That means they penetrate deep inside Ukraine. Flying at subsonic speeds, they're exposed for an hour or more as they snake through Ukraine. Their routes are often planned through areas where Russia thinks air defenses are thinner. While this graphic can't be verified, it shows nicely the differences between routes of different kind of weapons. Cruise missiles snake left and right, while Kinzhals and Iskanders fly straight. And even though cruise missiles fly low and thus shorten the radar horizon of enemy SAM systems, they still traverse a huge territory. Sooner or later, it may happen that some unplanned SAM system will be underneath the missile's route and that the missile will get intercepted. That's if it's not intercepted near the target area, which for strategic type of targets is usually going to be well protected by various SAM systems. What's perhaps a bit stranger is that caliber missiles, which are also large subsonic cruise missiles, have been intercepted less, at 49% of the time. Calibers are fired from ships. They're used against more tactical targets closer to the front line, and they don't go as deep into Ukraine. That may explain why they've been intercepted less. Russia has more numerous recon platforms when it comes to surveying the front line, and it can engage more of Ukraine's SAMs near the front line. So it's plausible that Russia can plan the entry routes into Ukraine's territory with better info on hand, so calibers overflying territories where there are indeed fewer Ukrainian SAMs. A quite similar missile, Iskander K, plausibly derived from Caliber, is launched from the ground as part of Iskander missile brigades. Curiously, its interception rate is even lower at 37%. One possible explanation is that, even though the same type of targets near the front line are attacked, the launch point itself is harder for NATO to track. As Calibers are launched from the Black Sea, NATO aircraft can more easily track the launch point, since they fly fairly close to Russian borders in the Black Sea. But Iskander Ks are often launched from Ukraine's northeastern border with Russia, and their launch points can't be tracked. Without that extra info on launch point and moment of launch, there is less time for Ukraine's defenses to prepare, and hence more missiles might slip through. Plus, it's also possible figures are simply less reliable here. Two missiles are very similar, and if the missile is not tracked from the launch, it may be very hard to tell them apart. Post-strike assessment may not always be done. Before we continue, let us just mention that without the support of our YouTube channel members and our Patreon members, Binkov's Battlegrounds would hardly be here. So if you think the info on the missiles in this video is informative, if you liked our previous videos, feel free to check out our YouTube channel membership or our Patreon link down below. Liking and subscribing also helps, due to the YouTube algorithm. Let's go on with our topic now. Another type listed is Ha-22. That's a huge Soviet-era missile. Its modernized variant, the Ha-32, is also listed together. Ukraine says it intercepted only 0.5% of the 360 missiles fired. It's a near Mach 5 missile when using a high trajectory, or a Mach 3 missile when using a mid-altitude glide trajectory. It's sort of in between a cruise missile and a ballistic one. It can change course, but generally it's designed to fly fairly straight to the target. One explanation why so few have been intercepted may involve missiles being quite imprecise when going after ground targets. That might imply they're also used against not so important targets, which again might suggest such targets are simply not gonna be protected well. Also, it is carried solely by Tu-22M bombers and fired from high altitude. Given that Russia does not have many of those, it might mean it launches from quite a distance to be sure they're not detected, and then the missile itself mostly goes against frontline targets, which are not often likely to have air defenses capable of engaging targets going over Mach 4, which is the likely mode Russia is using those missiles in, essentially turning them into ballistic missiles. There is the Onyx missile, which is also a supersonic anti-ship missile, which may have a land attack mode if it's using a GPS receiver. Its high speed reaches Mach 3 at high altitude, but perhaps it's more lethal at Mach 2 at very low altitude. That makes it sort of like a very fast cruise missile, leaving little time for reaction to the enemy. Onyx has a shorter range compared to various calibers and other subsonic cruise missiles, which likely means it's also more often used against targets closer to the front line, leading to fewer highly capable SAMs being available to Ukraine to intercept it. So its 5% interception rate may not be so strange. Ha-35 is again similar in the sense it's another anti-ship missile, but smaller and subsonic. Given that only 15 have been recorded as fired, the possible error margin is really too big to attempt an analysis of its quite low interception rate of 6%. There's the Tochka-U missile, which Ukraine also used. It's a short-ranged and not so advanced ballistic missile stemming from the Cold War era. It uses just inertial guidance, so it's not very precise. It was thus likely not used on important, well-guarded targets. Given that Ukraine has the very same system, it knows its radar signature and its capabilities, which may lead to somewhat better interception rates than for other ballistic missiles. Anyway, some 9% were intercepted, which is sort of in the ballpark of being expected. Then there's the Zircon missile. It's supposedly one of the most advanced missiles there are. Allegedly 6 were fired and 2 intercepted. But with such token figures, the margin for error in analysis is massive. It maintains a hypersonic speed, at times reaching even Mach 8, while flying so high that it evades all of Ukraine's SAM systems in its cruising phase. It can also change direction easily, unlike ballistic missiles. However, when it approaches a target, it slams into it from above, kinda like an Iskander would. So if it was used to go after Patriot batteries themselves, it would not be strange that it got intercepted. Once again, numbers used are so low that a single outlier event may have impacted them quite a bit. Its intercepted rate is 33%. More interesting than Zircon is a whole host of various missiles fired from aircraft. Ukraine really listed pretty much everything else in this category, which is unfortunate as there are huge differences in missile capabilities and guidance methods among those listed. Some stem from the Cold War. Also unfortunate is the fact Ha-35 is mentioned as well, which may lead to double counting, as we saw said model also listed separately. Maybe that's a typo and Ha-38 was meant to be listed, but who knows. The bottom line is, Ukraine said 22% of all those missiles were intercepted. Again, if a lot of those were frontline weapons against vehicles, bunkers, or super fast missiles against radars, it's to be expected their intercepted rate would be likely even under 10%, which then might even out various cruise missiles, which might have been intercepted at, say, 40% shoot-down rates. But here's a really curious category: SAM missiles repurposed for land attack role. Ukraine lists S-300 and S-400 SAMs used, which basically means the 48 and 6 missile that both systems use. A whopping 3,000 such missiles were allegedly used, and only 0.6% were intercepted. Said SAM missiles have been tested in purely ballistic trajectories, and 400-kilometer ranges and even more are not implausible. Downside is that there is no proper guidance. It's sort of like a big dumb MRL rocket, with a sizable warhead even. It's extremely fast though, reaching Mach 7 at burnout, and likely too fast for any sort of frontline target defenses to deal with. Russia has a surplus of such SAM missiles, as there is no aircraft threat. There are probably upward of 20,000 such missiles in the Russian arsenal. Russia has no issue with spending 1,000 such missiles per year on land attack roles. Right now, those SAM missiles Russia used are not such a huge issue due to their imprecision, but SatNav guidance is getting cheaper and cheaper. Newer 40 and 6 missiles most probably have such guidance included. They are low in numbers, and thus they haven't probably been used against land targets, as they are much more important in anti-aircraft roles. But when enough are produced in the future, Ukraine might be faced with a few hundred such missiles, fairly precise, landing on its units each year. In a way, they would be Russian equivalents of the US SM-6 SAM-COM multi-role missile. Finally, there's the category labeled Other and Unknown Missiles. Most are likely unidentified. They could be any of the missiles we listed here, though one would imagine that a unique flight profile Zircon would be hard to stay unidentified. Interception rate is 0%, so it could lower the rate of any weapon mentioned. Overall, Ukraine said Russia launched 23,600 missiles and attack drones in these 2.5 years, and that it managed to intercept 11,700. That's just under 50%. As we said, that statistic seems decent, though it's not quite what the media headlines were touting. When simpler attack drones are stripped from it, it gets cut in half to 25%. Of course, one can also say that when SAM-derived land attack missiles are subtracted from just the missile tally, said interception rate improves to 36%. Why would anyone do that? It could be argued that if one includes such SAM missiles, which are imprecise, then one might have to include all the multiple rocket launcher missiles, which are weapons of essentially similar role and precision, only often smaller. It's also worth noting that Russian missile defenses, despite their huge numbers, are also regularly having issues intercepting Ukraine's attacks into Russia, which are largely done with slow, easy-to-hit drones. So intercepting attacks is always hard. In the end, this list is more about showing that it's not necessarily the weapon that's important, but also how you use it, where you use it, against what sort of target, and what sort of defenses are there. All that massively impacts a weapon's efficiency. Problem for Ukraine is one of a trend. Not only are most of the Russian missiles going through and are not being intercepted, but Russia is increasing the number of missiles used. For example, in the first 130 days of 2024, Russia fired almost double the number of missiles it fired in the same period of 2023. Shahed attack drone usage went up by a factor of 4. If all that increase continues faster than the rate of new SAM systems going into Ukraine, Ukraine may then be facing quite a challenge in the medium term. The war is in a delicate phase for Ukraine, and the pace and number of additional air defense assets that Ukraine needs to get from NATO countries is of utmost importance. And remember, Binkov may talk about war, but only real peace can bring us all together.